All right. Well, welcome, folks. I'm really honored to be here. These sort of international efforts to work on behalf of children is a topmost priority of my own. And so when I get the opportunities to do so, I always jump at them. My particular view about our responsibility is that we should deal with the children of the world without regard, really, for what country they live in. Those aren't choices kids make. It's chance who they're born to, where they're born. So I like to think that that gives us the responsibility to partner with each other, share resources, share research, and so forth, so that we can help the kids develop in a healthy way. I've been doing this for 4 decades and have some slides to show you. Hopefully, let's see. Um, Hopefully you'll find them interesting. Let's see here. There we go. So I
Yes,
put
sir,
these,
we can see it full
Amazing.
screen. Thank you.
I put these together over time and just continuously edit them to adapt them for presentations. There are a lot of slides, so I'm going to end up going kind of quickly. I hope to come in time. If not, I'm happy to stay a few minutes later if that's possible with the host. So let's jump in. The title of the presentation is Social and Emotional Developmental Challenges of Gifted Children. So this is where I'm located. I'm currently the Dean of the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Louisiana. Here are a small sample of places we've published our research over the past 30 or 40 years. This is
Sir, could you please switch to the next slide because you are still the first slide? Make sure that you change slides.
This was an image of some of the things we've published over the years. Okay, let's start with this slide. This is a good one for us to keep in the front of our mind when we're talking about children. Gifted students are the most heterogeneous group to study because they can vary the most on the most number of variables. Now, that's really a positive thing, but it makes our jobs a little more complicated. That means that it's hard to stereotype them. It's hard to say that gifted kids all have any particular quality or feature. So we have to remain humble when we try to typify them. So one of the things that we attempt to do, and I'm a psychologist, of course, so I commit psychology all the time. We talk with thousands and thousands of parents about their children, and here are three things that come up the most commonly. What do they want for their children? Number one, frankly, is their children to be happy, healthy, and productive. And in some environments, the word safe is used quite a bit, but these are the most common we hear. So we want for our children to be happy, healthy, and productive. Now, when you add the next one to it, you establish through these other experiences and qualities a psychological well-being, and that's sort of our goal. We want our children to thrive, and gifted children no less so. There are things about gifted children that are unique to them, and there are things about them that are quite common to other children. So I'll try to share over the next little bit research that we've done primarily, but others too, to establish what matters in their lives as they develop. Now, this is another one of these kind of statements we need to just put in our hat and think about throughout the presentation. No matter what adult people think, no matter how insightful they are, no matter how in tune they are with children, a person's experience is what the world is to that person. It isn't what other people think or what they experience. It's very much right here between the ears of the child. So as they develop, they're experiencing and thinking about all sorts of things that other people never see, never fully understand, may not even anticipate. So that's an important aspect when you think about children's development. So I'm going to start with some challenges to that happiness, mental health, productivity, et cetera. I'm going to do it categorically. We talk about people a lot as a psychologist in terms of endogenous characteristics. That basically means things about the person. I happen to be very introverted, and there are certain social settings that I don't particularly enjoy, but it's more of the anticipation of it than it is the actual experience of it. See, so the anxiety I feel is an anticipation. So it's about the person, it's not the environment per se, and those are endogenous characteristics. Of course, the other half then becomes exogenous, meaning it's the interaction of that person in the context of their family and their community and perhaps their school. The ongoing interaction of that individual person who has those unique experiences and thoughts over time develop them into who they are. And along the way, of course, there are trials and tribulations. And our job as adults is to look after them, anticipate them, teach them, help them adapt, and so forth. My wife is a psychologist who does a lot of research in this field, and she put this together, and I thought it was really quite clever to illustrate um, to illustrate one person's life in terms of things that we've been told over the years are commonly said, primarily to females, not exclusively, but primarily. And I want you to just hear them in context, because as you think about it, perhaps you had some of these experiences, perhaps you still do. Say a kid has a real passion in an area, but the family can't really afford to provide special lessons. Say it's piano. So that's just something they can't control. Something that gifted kids hear a lot are things like "you are so smart." Emphasize you are something as opposed to you can do things. That are something is a double-edged sword, because it establishes that you can disappoint people by not always being what they say you are. And giftedness is one of those labels that is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the exogenous world, in the outside world, whereas the individual person doesn't experience it that way. They're just experiencing expectations of other people. So females will be told some things that are very interesting, again, that males aren't always. And I'll play it up in the next slide or two. But I just want you to see sort of this visual of natural life cycle of some women. And things are salient at different times of their lives. And if you want to see a good explanation of this, you might look at Erik Erikson's work on essential strengths and how developmentally across the lifespan we have the opportunity to develop strengths, psychosocial strengths that help us move from infancy to old age, I'll say, by developing these essential skills like hope. So, for example, when newborn babies are born, when newborns, if they're cared for, they're fed regularly, they're changed, they're held. Those three qualities over time tend to engender in that child a general attitude of hope. Well, that is very important, especially in the research that I do on suicidal behavior of gifted students, is whether or not hope exists can some extent enable us to predict suicidal behavior. So learning it as a new child is very important to their overall psychological well-being. 2-year-olds in the States, we like to call them terrible twos. And what that means is they're very active, very energetic. They're wired to experiment with the world, which for adults, of course, wears us out and it causes us to worry about them because they're always experimenting. Sometimes they may stick a fork or a knife into a wall socket, but their experimentation is biological. It's there to help them develop. And so they're fun to watch, especially if they're your grandchildren. I can vouch for that. But when our children were 2 years old, it was really something. But it's important to them because what comes as an essential skill from that is called will. And willpower is very important just to endure. All of us who are here today could probably name 25 or 30 times in our lives where we had to endure things that were difficult, maybe very difficult. So I'm not going to go through the whole list with you. They're very available on the slides with you. The third one, though, I do want to comment on is called purpose. Purpose. So as young children are developing, according to Erickson, they're developing a sense of purpose. Why am I here? What should I be doing? What can I be doing? What's important to do, etc. Part of that, of course, is being a child within a family or a child within a community. But that broadens out to be perhaps a world citizen. Competence. One of the great things that our school systems do for our young children as they're developing is by teaching them the kind of things that we do in elementary school is we teach them competence. They know they can do things. They learn in the States when they're very early in school how to cut with scissors, how to glue things, how to tape things, how to fold things, how to tell time, how to tie their shoes, et cetera, et cetera. And the accumulation of that builds confidence in themselves that they're competent, that they can do things. So this is something to think about. If you have time, I would encourage you to do so. It very much guides our work that we've done over the past 40 years or so. You can't talk about these subjects, in my opinion, without paying homage to Uri Brauvenbrenner. He's really quite special. And what he created is this three-dimensional notion of things that help people develop into what they are. Hopefully you've seen it. If you've gone to college, chances are, especially if you've ever taken a psychology class, you've seen this. But let's just heighten a couple of points here. When you live in history matters, right? The children of today and the events going on in the world will matter because it will leave a big handprint on them, in some cases more than that. So the time matters when you're growing up. The family structure is usually the thing with the most impact, or especially early on. Then there are things outside the immediate family, like the neighborhood or the church group, things that the family does that puts people in regular communication over time, and that helps them see models, role models, what is being expected or how to be in a certain culture and so forth. I want to go on to the exosystem because once a child gets to the point where they have friends, then the evolution to adulthood speeds up a little in the sense that their immediate family isn't the only thing that's influencing them. It becomes their peers start influencing them quite a bit. And one of the things that we're having to reinterpret Brauvenbrenner's work is by putting social media in here and trying to identify, measure how social media is affecting all these different systems that impact them. So one of the things that I'd like to do in this presentation is talk about a few things that are fairly common to gifted kids. There aren't many that I'm going to say are true for all gifted kids because there just aren't that many. But where it's supportable, I want to share them with you. One of the is this. Some people in the field believe that the best definition of giftedness is what we call asynchronous development, which means if you look across different areas of development like physicality, emotionality, social, and cognitive, that we expect naively that people are going to develop in this gradual plane from where they are as a young person, maybe a newborn, to adulthood. Well, it looks like that if you measure 1,000 people in average performance. But if you look at an individual person's development on any of these examples, it tends to be a stair step where they don't show any particular development for maybe a year, maybe longer, and then they'll shoot up. You see it a lot in height, the growth of height. And sometimes young boys in particular, but not exclusively, over a summer away from school, in some cases, will grow three or 4 or 5 inches over a summer. So when they come back to school, people are really astonished at how much taller they are. That's an example of these changes. Now, we naively kind of assumed that they would all stay on par with each other, right? Work together, the 4 of them. But in fact, it doesn't work that way. They're somewhat independent of each other. So some of the smallest gifted children you see may be the most advanced. So the physicality piece doesn't necessarily mean that their brain isn't developing even faster than others. So in gifted children, what we tend to see is disparities across these and a couple of other areas. So in school, it creates real problems in the United States because most of our teachers don't like many of our options for dealing with this. So what do you do instructionally if you're a second grade teacher and you learn that one of your children can do algebra. Do you hold them back to stay within the curriculum that they may have mastered the year before, or do you allow them to work at their own pace? To me, that's a very important question. And in the United States, there are all sorts of views about it. Teachers tend to be worried about allowing kids to go far ahead of the other children. They think there's safety by keeping them together by age. Perhaps there is, but I can tell you that research that we've done in the States suggests that it's in their overall well-being to let them move at their own pace. So when you have that occasional gifted child who's operating class levels ahead of others, accommodating that is healthier for them psychologically, socially, than just requiring them to sit there and not learn anything. So it's a bit of a bone of contention, if you will, in the United States. I'm not sure what it's like in Kazakhstan, but something to think about. Some gifted children aren't particularly astute socially, but you know what? Some of the leaders in the school are gifted kids. So the stereotype in the States that a lot of people believe is that to be gifted means you're socially inadequate. Well, that's only because people who are socially inadequate are easy to see. Many of the people who are, I'll say, I want to be careful how I say this. Some of our presidents in the United States were really brilliant people, but not all of them. I'll leave it at that. So here are some characteristics that are we call possible gifted characteristics. Barb Clark put together some years ago. And what this means is these are things that we often see, but we don't really see them all in a single person necessarily. Pretty much we don't. But we have seen all of these in gifted people. And there's that heterogeneity conflict that we struggle with quite a bit. So I'll just mention a few of them. It's fun when you see a young gifted child who's very insightful, right? Either in just regular conversation or in a subject matter. Some gifted kids are very intense. That's one of the things I look for. But you know what? Some gifted kids aren't intense at all. Doggone it. So now we don't really know how to use that variable except to say, keep an eye out. Some gifted kids are highly sensitive or empathetic. Some are not. Some have a passion to need, they have a need to know, a need to understand. Other kids are rather laid back. So these things can't be said as true for all gifted kids. They're just not. Some gifted kids don't conform very much. Some gifted kids are perfectionistic. For years, we've tried to force this round peg into a square hole of saying that all gifted kids are perfectionistic. We know that isn't true. Now, some are, and when they are, it's easy to see. Some kids persevere. Some kids don't persevere. Things that affect perseverance can be contextual. Acute self-awareness. Some are very much like this, and those who are sometimes go into certain social science professions like psychologists, nursing, some physicians of certain types of physician. A common thing that we observe about a lot of gifted kids is they have an excellent sense of humor. It doesn't mean that they're funny, and it doesn't mean that they perform humor. It means they understand why things are funny. And if you just think about that a minute, why might that be true for high ability kids? It'll make sense to you since so much of different kinds of humor are contextually oriented. Some gifted kids need precision. They need logic, and that's what they rely on. And then some gifted kids are known for questioning authority or rules. So these are just some of the variations, and you realize, wow, it's really hard to typify these kids. So they're going to live their lives, for the most part, early lives, in school. And schools are institutions of any culture. So they tend to host the values of the community in which they live, generally speaking. There are some differences there. There are schools that are placed away from local communities, so the values that the school wants to offer might be considerably different than the home community. So let's think of a gifted child who has some of these, not all of these, again, because they wouldn't have all of these traits, but let's say they have some of them. Let's say they're sensitive, they're somewhat independent, they're analytical, maybe they're creative, they're persistent, and they're in a school that sends them mixed messages about what the school really wants. And there are school structures in the school that impede them from being able to, say, enjoy studying things that they're really interested in, passionate about. Then you lay on there, and most societies have issues around sex roles, gender. And in the States, that's been a real problem, that our expectations for males and females have varied quite significantly. It's changing a lot, such that now many of our top scientists are female. The gifted role, what does it mean in a particular setting? And I can tell you in the United States, we have 15,000, not quite, but let's say 15,000 school districts. Each one has its own school board. The school board determines what the schools are responsible for and how they do it. Each state, there are 50 states and other parts of our country, and each state decides the big picture of what schools are supposed to do. Then you have pressures and influences based on the geography of small rural communities want children to stay there and follow in the footsteps of parents. Now that's not really doing them justice, but I'm trying just to make this point. People who live in big cities will often have other types of expectations. And so there's some ongoing tension in our country. We can't agree on what a single definition of giftedness is. School districts that butt up to each other often have different rules about giftedness. So kids being, kind of in the middle on these things. We literally have many situations in a year. Just moved from Virginia to Louisiana. It's true in Louisiana too. That school districts that butt up to each other often have different definitions of giftedness. So the kids caught in the middle, and that's how it is in the States. I'm not sure how it is in Kazakhstan. So in any case, this interaction between the individual children's characteristics and the environment in a school create problems. Almost always, not always, but almost always. Okay, here are a few statements that gifted kids have reported to us and young people, not just children, but through high school. On one hand, they get this message, be the best you can be. Work as hard as you can, be the best student you can be. Socially, females in particular often hear, but don't be too good. Because if you're too good, you're going to stand out. And in 1950s USA, in some small communities, if you stand out as a female being really passionate, say, about STEM fields, that parents worry that you're going to be mistreated, frankly. Be smart, but don't be too smart. Again, more of a female message. So we want you to be smart. It's better to be thought of as smart. The kids say that than not smart, but you don't want to stand out as too smart. There are sort of social sanctions that come with that. Study hard, but don't spend all your time studying. In the States now, it's less of a problem that they're studying hard, and although that happens a lot, but it's also spending so much time on social media. Make friends, but study hard. Okay, that's not always compatible. Be well-rounded, but develop a specific talent that you could have as a career. Do well, but don't stand out. Now, how is that for information if you're a young person trying to navigate the social aspects of schooling? The man to the left of me in that picture is Lawrence Coleman, and he was my closest friend and mentor. We worked together for 30 years and wrote many, many things together. And perhaps the thing we're best known for is what's called the stigma of giftedness paradigm. That at least in the US, but we found in a lot of countries because we do a lot of international research, this stigma of giftedness exists in many countries. Now, it's some ways overlaps with the states and some ways are more unique to a particular country. But the gist of it is this. So the next few slides are going to share some detail about, these are lives of kids now we're talking about. By and large, gifted kids want to have normal social interactions. What's normal? Normal's idiosyncratic. There isn't a generic normal. I'm introverted. I don't require a lot of social interaction. My wife is extroverted. She gets energy when she goes out and spends a lot of time with groups of people. So what normal is decided by the individual person. Gifted kids learn that people will treat them differently when they learn that they're gifted. Doesn't necessarily mean worse, but differently if they weren't thought of as being gifted. Okay. And then one of the things we do in most families is we teach our children how to behave differently in different settings. Said differently, different settings call for different behavior. If you go to church of any sort and your children are with you, think about the behavior we expect in church compared to going to a sporting event or going to a mall or a store, any sort of large outdoor or indoor event. There's a lot of latitude there. In the States, the one I like to talk about a lot is elevator behavior. In the States, there are certain ways that we expect our children to behave on an elevator that we teach them. And we have great fun talking about how easy it is to infract these social rules by doing something small. And normally we have a lot of fun with this, but I'm not going to take up too much of your time with that today. So there seems to be a prevailing stigma of giftedness that gifted kids realize in most cases, and then they adapt. They make adaptations because they learn that other people will treat them differently if they're primarily thought of as gifted. I'm just going to touch on this. These are 3 studies. We started doing this research in the 80s, and we've done it very recently in Ireland, like in the last 3 or 4 years, a number of studies, and we've done it in the States with children from financially modest backgrounds, many of whom are African American, but not exclusively, a wide range there. The orange color represents the research we started doing in the middle 80s. We had in one study about almost 1,500 kids. The green group are kids from Ireland, and I can't recall it exactly, but I think we had about 800, well, let's see, 500 kids in that study. And we've done multiple studies. I'm just showing you one of them. And then the blue represents the what we call the low income students from some of our programs, those who come from modest means. So we set up scenarios. Larry and I did interviews and surveys of kids, and we asked them, when in school are you aware of being gifted? And over a few years, we developed what were 6 scenarios, 6 things that they said, these are times in school where I'm quite aware of being gifted, and in some cases, they adapt their behavior accordingly. Well, what does that look like? How does it play out? So if you'll look on the top left, and you'll notice these words: truth, placate, cop out, preface no answer, and lie. Truth is what it sounds like. Someone asks you a question, you just tell them a response. Truth. Placate's a little more complicated. You're aware that what you're about to say might separate you from other kids. So instead of just saying, here's the truth, you first make a prefacing comment like, tests can be hard. I made a so-and-so. So the test can be hard preface is something that a lot of gifted kids use to say, I'm like you before I give you the truth. Okay. So it's not exactly the truth, but it's only a step away from it. The cop-out response is a category of responses where they ask you a direct question and your response is to shift your answer to another person. So they might say, Tracy, how'd you do on that test? And my response is, I wonder how Janie did. Now, I didn't think people talk that way, but I've learned in the last 30 years that people use that kind of strategy all the time. I hear it all the time, that people don't want to answer a question or they're more interested in another person's response, so they shift that question to another person. They don't reveal anything about themselves. The next one, preface no answer, is my favorite of these categories because they'll use words of the conversation to answer or to address something that was asked of them, but the words don't reveal anything about them. And I'll give you one example and we'll move on. And then the last category, of course, is lying. Now, when we started this, we didn't assume that kids would lie about anything particularly. Well, and you'll see in this scenario, that first one, they don't lie in that scenario because that scenario was a time when they said, well, there's only a little bit of worry in this particular thing. So that particular thing was knowing the definition of a single word. The word was onomatopoeia. And so we learned from talking and listening to gifted kids over 40 years that in school settings, knowing one piece of information isn't that threatening to your social latitude. So most of the kids told the truth in all the groups. And then the placate response, that includes the truth, but not until you try to play that truth down and be part of the group. That between the two, that made up most of the responses. Almost no kids lied. There was no threat to them, hardly, very little. So let's drop down to the bottom one. Notice the pattern differences. That's what we like to call in research a rectilinear distribution. And you'll note that there's quite variation there. There are answers that, in terms of responses, are similar to each other. So whatever this is, was much greater threatening possibility to the student than the other two. But you see the three groups have different patterns. That means here are times in school where they behave differently based on their perceptions of social attitude. So at the bottom, I'll just run through this quickly. This is a situation they said is the most threatening for gifted kids. After a hard test in school, kids are standing around talking, and you're a student who's thought to be gifted. And then they say something to you like, boy, that test was really hard. Tracy, I bet you didn't even study and did very well, didn't you? Now, in actuality, what you said was, I did study, because that's common for gifted kids, is to take learning more seriously. I did study, but it wasn't a very hard test. So that would be a truthful response. And you'll notice that it ranged from about 22% to about 35, 36% across those groups. Tell the truth in that most threatening environment. But notice the lie response. Notice the green. Green is our Irish students. This was something we do a lot of research in Ireland. I've been very fortunate to have two Fulbrights in Ireland and lived there a couple of years. And so it shows us that the dynamic varies in location. And the seriousness of it really affects the kids' behaviors because it affects their lives in schools. So it means that the Irish kids were more likely to lie in this situation than tell the truth, more likely to lie than any of the other options. And having lived in Ireland for a while, I understand it. It's not a pernicious lying. It's lying to stay a part of a group, just to not stand out, be the opposite of bragging. One of the terms I've learned the kids share with us is slagging. That it's a term used to when kids give another kid a hard time about something, like bragging. So they'll slag them. They'll say things that's meant to put them in their place, not in an ugly way necessarily, but like, I'm aware that what you're saying is a form of bragging, even though the person may not be saying anything bragging. But if you're known to be a gifted child, how you say things really can get interpreted very differently. So this taught us lessons that this stuff is as viable today as it ever was. It exists. We did a 6 country study. We did 7, but one of the countries ultimately couldn't use 6 studies that we looked at this and other things. And sure enough, this stigma of giftedness exists in many countries. Kids are dealing with it today, and how they deal with it takes up a lot of their time and causes them worry. I just want to mention Festinger's social comparison theory, because one of the questions I get asked most often about what we're talking about today is, are there experiences that are unique to gifted kids? And there frankly aren't that many, but there are some. And one of them categorically can be described by Festinger's work about social comparison within schools. Could be schools, could be churches, synagogues, whatever group where kids and adults spend time, sports teams where they're together. There are upward and downward comparisons. I used to play a lot of sports, and you know, I guess you would say it was widely known who we thought the most talented athletes were on our teams, or the ones who worked the hardest, or the most effective, or whatever terms we'd use. But that upward or downward comparison was something common in cultures. Well, not many people will describe other people who aren't high achieving um, in ways that would be an upward comparison. In other words, I'm an average student, I work hard, I do okay, but Janie is a fantastic student, works hard, and is always the top performer. That's an upward comparison. So this is an area in schools where I'm most interested, where gifted kids' lives are very affected. Because if you're thought of as being the top performer, it takes all that's possible for you and limits it to a stereotype. So these comparisons are things that gifted kids attempt to navigate for the most part. But I bet everybody today here knows of a gifted child who pays no attention to anything socially and sort of plows ahead with no regard for how their performance affects other kids, or hurt feelings, or the struggles of other kids when he or she does really well. So those kids exist, but they're certainly not the majority. So in a summary statement, if you will, here's a brief description of age-related progressions and environmental impacts on relatedness. A lot of words there. Developmentally, elementary, middle, and high school. What's a summary statement of how their lives look developmentally as a gifted child? Elementary kids are often kind of proud and comfortable doing well in school if they do. Okay? It's also not the biggest thing on their mind much of the time. However, if they experience any peer rejection, they're pretty surprised by it. It just doesn't make much sense to a young mind. When they move into middle school, if you think about the age in that range, all sorts of social things are kicking in as they mature physically and so forth. And so they're now becoming aware of difficulties, things like high expectations, jealousy, rejection. These things about giftedness and not about giftedness coexist in schools. You can layer in there a need for authenticity and other things. So middle school becomes a very fertile ground for a lot of kids to start getting worried about and upset by all sorts of forms of social comparisons. Friendships form, they break up, kids are left out of groups, all these things are happening. In high school, there's a little more maturity now, and they're looking oftentimes, when you think of gifted kids, if they're high performing, many of them want to go on to something post high school, right? So some of the social stuff diminishes in their experiences or concern, and their focus tends to be more futuristic. So middle school is like this deep immersion in these issues and concerns of children and development. Now, again, one of the live wires in all this is social media, that we know it exacerbates certain aspects of issues related to mental health, and we're studying them as best we can, but we don't really have it captured yet. Hope you find this interesting. To me, this is fascinating stuff. Okay. So I'm trying to distill in this frame, what is the essence of the lived experience of being gifted? Lived experience, so more of a phenomenological view. It means that you're different from others in two ways. An ability at some level, and motivation to learn, usually more serious about learning. In some research, we were clear that gifted kids, if you say, are you the same as or different from other kids? Their response is usually, oh, I'm the same, pause, except I might be a little more serious about learning. That is a regular comment. Now, it isn't always so, but it's the most regular way they describe their lives is being same as or different from. Seriousness about learning is really important for a lot of reasons, right? So here's a summary of things that are relatively common among high ability or gifted kids. They often, not all of them, learn faster. Not always, not always. My brother-in-law is a physicist, worked at the Oak Ridge National Labs for decades. He's someone I noticed, I've known him for 50 years, is kind of a slow, methodical reader. And he has a memory for what he reads that's just staggering. And his response to me when I asked him about it, he said, well, Tracy, in physics, you can't be wrong. It's most important that you be right. So how you read needs to represent that. Well, okay. Yeah, I read a lot for pleasure, and I can't remember 2 weeks after I've read a novel many of the details. So two ways of being. Gifted kids often want to understand things very deeply. Not always, but when they do, it's very apparent. Now, this third one's very interesting to me. Are more engaged in content of interest to them. The more intense and exotic, the more noticeable. So if they're interested in the same things as their best friends are, they won't stand out very much. It's not uncommon, though, for gifted kids to have hobbies or other passion areas. I have a son who got interested in the drums when he was 7 or 8 years old and seemed to have some talent because in no time they were featuring him in school during concerts and stuff. And he's now 33 years old and he has a YouTube channel where he's a recording engineer. So he teaches people how to record music, and it's worldwide, and he's got about 50,000 subscribers and all sorts of different groups. And he also plays in two bands. Baroque Royals is his current band, and they have several albums and CDs, and you know what I mean. So he's very talented, but he also understands social media quite well, and he's a fine teacher. So he has these qualities. But when he was little, for a while, we were worried about him because he got so obsessed with drums. That's all he wanted to talk about: drums, drums, drums. And he would study them. He would study where the wood is, that's where it comes from, and how it's processed to make the best drums that you could buy. And I used to kid that it was a manifestation or test of a dad's love for his son that I'd sit down with him when he was 11 years old and we'd talk. I'd listen for 2 hours as he described these things to me. So it's not uncommon in young gifted children for them to become somewhat obsessed with something. And as long as it's not unhealthy for them, then don't worry about it, because we're seeing relationships between early obsessions with future careers. Pretty cool. That's why I use this example of my son. He earns a living having created this page book that underwrites his bands, and he's just grown into a spectacular teacher. But it started when he was 7 years old. This last thing is something we intuitively all know, and that is small differences at early ages over time can make big differences. A lot of that's about opportunity. The easiest case to think about is world-class pianist. A lot of us in the field started studying world-class people in different areas: music, art, dance, etc., physics, studying their lives and working backwards to the point of, well, what was it like when they were 5 years old in their home? What did they study in school? How did they spend their time? And there are certain patterns that we see, say violin, that world-class violinists now start by at least age 4 and practice 90 minutes a day in many cases. Now, I don't know about you, but my life was not such that I would do anything for 90 minutes a day when I was 4 years old, sleep. But that means that there's a very strong parental influence there. And quite often the parents are musicians themselves of world-class violinists. Pianists are similar. The amount of time spent practicing and having good instruction to become a world-class pianist is quite a lot, substantial. Now think about access to a piano. For some, access to a violin might be easier than access to a piano. And so my question to you about all this is how many world-class pianists are never known because they had no access to pianos, great teachers, time to practice, et cetera, et cetera. I can't give you an estimate, but I'm sure it's hundreds of thousands of people across the world. So there's all this undeveloped talent that in many cases we never know about. So let's just kind of commit ourselves to understanding that we know somewhat what we call these individual patterns or tracks of getting from childhood to adulthood and being quite expert at something. Talent development, most of us, not most of us, but many of us in the US have moved to a talent development model of giftedness rather than our traditional models that we've used for many years. Because talent development assumes that every child can learn and that if you adapt to them appropriately and help provide the resources they need, then what we'll see is far more of these experts emerging in different fields. Some little kids, as I noted, dinosaurs for some kids are an area that they become passionate with and they spend untold time with and they show incredibly intense interest and so forth, and they stay with it over time. So here are a few ways that gifted label can be advantageous or disadvantageous. They can gain access to gifted programming and sometimes with their friends. Well, that just makes their learning more enjoyable and they're more likely to stay with it. In the States, this isn't always true by any means, but sometimes gifted programs are thought to have the better teachers in them. Now, again, I would be very cautious about interpreting that way, but we know it's true in some settings in the US. Some. By and large, high ability kids in special programs or with special adaptations for their abilities spend less time being bored in school. That's a real problem in the States is boredom. Some disadvantages. Um, if you're gifted, you're thought to be perfect. You know everything, and kids can be pretty tough on you, and even teachers can be pretty tough on you if they believe you should know something or have some ability at it, but you don't. And it's just not fair to think that way, but it is common. Expectations, they will always apply themselves. That's just not true. You know, some gifted kids don't apply themselves at all. And so you see this early potential, and then it doesn't develop much over time, or they become adequate at it when they could have been outstanding at it. And then sometimes you can be a target of taunts. You can be held up in a classroom as, why can't you be more like Janie? And that's a terrible feeling, both for Janie and for whoever that's being said to. Just a minute about waiting. In the United States, one of the most common experiences of being a gifted student is waiting. Waiting for other kids to catch up, waiting to be challenged, waiting to be allowed to move on to something else, to pursue something of your interest. So there are all these different structural ways that high ability kids wait, spend a lot of time in school. I don't know how you are, but I find waiting boring, right? How long? If you have a microwave that helps you cook your food, I find it wonderfully funny that things that now take 20 seconds to cook, we can still get frustrated with how long that takes. It says a lot about a lot of things, including Americans' eating habits. We interviewed, or Marie Piney, who was one of Larry Coleman's doctoral students, interviewed many gifted students. And this was one of the phrases I pulled out of her dissertation that I thought was really important for us to know. And that is that waiting is boring, but sometimes waiting is fair. In other words, few gifted kids think that they have the absolute right to never have to wait. there's usually a kindness associated with this that kids learn over time. They might not have that feeling or awareness at age 6, but oftentimes, certainly by high school and maybe a little before, they can see that other kids are struggling with things and they're not, and a little bit of waiting isn't terrible. At the same time, we've got studies to show that some kids come into a certain grade, say grade 3, where they've already completely managed all that material, um, and they now have to sit in the same class instruction for 190 days on material they long known. That kind of waiting is very detrimental. Okay, I've talked about identity generally. I just want to say a couple of things here about it, and then I'm gonna kind of wrap up a little bit with suicide. If you ask gifted kids, do you feel the same as or different from other students? They're reluctant to say they're different. But if you just pause a second, what we found in our research that we've done for 40 years is about 90, roughly 90% of them will say, well, I feel the same, except I'm more serious about learning. Or in some cases, and there are less of those, this example, they'll say, I'm the same, except maybe have a little more ability in that area or more passion. But it's usually more serious about learning, more interested in and serious about. And that's important because as families, as teachers, educators concerned, we need to pay attention to where their passion lies. And if we can fuel that, then we're probably going to help them in the future. So the wrapping up of this, trying to help their psychosocial lives develop, try to help them get to a point of psychological well-being, we have to understand that they want to be thought of as normal. They are normal, and they're high ability, and they work hard for the most part. And this pull of normality is very strong, exceptionally strong during middle school years, continues somewhat in high school, depending upon if they go to college where, it could be there too. The allure of acceptability and the pull of normality. Those are hard things to escape from for most people. So being treated as normal in the classroom may result in inaccurate assessments of their abilities. But some kids would rather not stand out and have more social latitude. And gosh, there are many of our gifted kids who are like that. Okay, I'm going to move to this slide. In the States right now, if you ask many kids, not just gifted kids, but get many kids about their school lives, they're going to say things like we have on this, that they just feel pressure all the time, stress. They're feeling a lot of anxiety. And some of it is around expectations for high performance. And for some of our students, the ones who are most encouraged to go to our most elite colleges, the amount of pressure and stress they feel is really worrisome to me as a psychologist. Okay, common mental health concerns, anxiety, depression, suicidal behaviors. Anxiety is fairly common as it is in the general population. Depression, less common, but if you imagine our lives as like this, things occur in our lives, say the death of a family member, where we tend to sink low, we tend to become depressed, and then we come back out of it over time. That's healthy. Being depressed and low or exceptionally anxious and low for a long period of time, that's problematic. Going like this is problematic. So we have, and generally speaking, as a species, a biological set of ways of being that make us stay on the road, help us keep in a certain range of normal behavior. And some depression and some anxiety is, but more depression, I'll say. Some depression is normal and not unhealthy, but it can be threatening. So I'm going to jump down here. So let's talk just briefly about some things we talk about make it sound like every gifted child has these concerns. And that's not true about anything. Maybe high potential, maybe asynchronous development. A lot of gifted kids aren't perfectionistic. Some are. But the high incidence things listed here are things that are more common than not. Boredom. I haven't met hardly any gifted kids who get through a school year who haven't spent a lot of the time being bored, unless we adapt instruction to help them with their own pacing. Multipotentiality, we didn't talk much about yet. Oftentimes, gifted people are good at more than one thing. And sometimes those things are in different fields. So which one do they get encouraged to pursue? In the States, we've got some real obvious gender patterns where boys were encouraged more to the STEM areas and females to social sciences. But over time, that's come like this. There's this big fish, little pond effect that some gifted kids experience, and that is in their local area, schools perhaps, they might be the best student in the whole school. Then they move to a bigger school or a different community, and now all of a sudden they might be one of 100 really great students. So they are no longer a big fish in a little pond. Now maybe they go to your country's best known universities, and now they're among thousands of really high ability kids or people. So the big fish, little pond is something that a lot of high ability kids have to deal with. So low incidence things are depression, mental illness, multiple exceptionality, say more than two, and suicidal behavior. So I'm just going to say a few things about suicidal behavior. See if I can get to my trigger warning, okay? Now, I've written a lot on this. We've done a number of studies. We do what are called psychological autopsies. Every one of those, the first three we did in a year or two. The last three we've done, each one taking about 4 years. So when we do one of these studies, we look at everything we can get our hands on about the child's life. Their friends and family, of course, classmates, all the books they had available to them, music they listened to, cataloging things like if they had guns and things, which in the States, of course, is very common. So I just want to give you a heads up. So for a couple of minutes, we'll talk about this, but just to set the stage on a couple of matters. And if you'd like future information, just send me a note. Be happy to try to help. Okay, in the world of suicidal behavior, the square box shows what we call suicide ideation. Many people have thought at least one time about taking their own lives in one point or another, one way or another. But you notice how big that is relative to completions. And actually, that small circle of completions should be about the size of an end of a pen. So suicide ideation is common. It's certainly common in the United States. Now, a very small subset will ever make an attempt. Very small. And then those who actually complete is a very small subset of attempters. So it is in every culture. It's more prevalent in some cultures than others. Its cause agents can be everything from mental health issues, and that's how it's defined in the United States. It used to be legal issues. Now it's mental health, has been for a while. And in some countries, it has to do with pride, too, or guilt, or embarrassment, or humiliation. And while that's true in the States somewhat, it's not as true in the States generally as it is in some other countries. So it's something we want to pay attention to. So do some gifted people die by suicide? The answer is yes. And we've studied their lives, some, a small handful, in extreme levels of detail trying to understand them. So here in a nutshell is what I can say. The Center for Disease Control in the USA is an important outfit. And right now, there's no CDC data on giftedness and suicide. None. They don't keep records that indicate whether a person was thought to be gifted or not. And we've looked at this for years, and we don't have it. The psychological autopsy is a really insightful way of doing research, but our numbers are so small, it's hard to generalize from them. We can say some things about the dynamic of suicide among these gifted people, but we can't easily generalize it to a larger group. We see in the United States a few years ago, Palo Alto is a public school district. They had 9 suicides in 18 months among their student body. And they died by, all but one died by train, which in the United States, I'm pretty sure is a first. The Fairfax Public Schools had 7 suicides in their school district over a period of about a year. William and Mary University had 5 in a year, and MIT had 8 in a year. Now, those are large numbers and concerning, and as you see the year there. And that may have been the height of a particular type of a set of stressors that were happening, but it does happen. And my wife and I work in suicide prevention in different countries and at different universities, and I often get asked to go into areas where there's suicide contagion, where more than one person has died in ways that were probably related in one form or another. So what do I want you to know, take with you about suicide? One, unless you have a Ph.D. in clinical psychology or a form of psychiatry and you specialize in suicide, don't expect yourself to be expert. That's not reasonable. And by expecting that, it often stops our behavior. Gosh, I've gone too long, haven't I? A couple of minutes and I promise I'll be finished. This is important to me. So we don't want to assume too much for ourselves and we don't want to assume too little. As caring adults, what we need to do is literally and figuratively put our arm around a child we think is showing distress. And we know what distress looks like. It can be anger, it can be frustration, it could be the child wearing the same clothes 2 or 3 days in a row. Look for that level of issue. Put your arm around them, see if you can get them to a counselor. You need a more professional expertise to get to the suicide treatment aspect, potentially. Don't worry about misclassifying because you're not classifying. You're just looking for distress. And by doing so, we will keep some children alive because once we get them to a point where there is a professional who has the kind of training we're talking about, there's a good chance that they'll be successful. There's a long-standing myth in the States, once suicidal, always suicidal. Not true at all. Harvard did a massive study on this, and from what I recall, I will say 90+% of people who'd made a suicide attempt in their earlier life were still alive decades later. So that's not true. So buying time is sort of the most important thing we can do. And as educators, as parents, in most fields, we are clearly able to tell when a child's in distress. And that's the level we need to operate. So I'm going to end here in my presentation since I've gone long, and I appreciate those of you who could stay back. And I guess I'll ask the leaders to help us move to the next stage. I understand there might be some questions. And thank you all for coming today.